Okay. So, what I wanted to do today was to talk about contemplative practices. The idea being that, you know, we want to be able to reach people's minds and to change their minds, but we know that cognitive dissonance, um, knowing that climate change is a real problem, but not wanting to think about it, we know that this is very common, right? So throwing more words at people may not be the best strategy. For many people, what's called embodied knowing is essential. And so it may be the case that actually persuading people to do mindfulness practice, as Piero does all the time, might be something that would enable a lot of people to start on a path that would lead towards environmental action. So I'm going to be talking about some exercises, some of them traditional and some of them kind of new, that were made up mainly by Joanna Macy and are contained in some of her books, such as Coming Back to Life or Active Hope. Anyway, recent studies have shown that experience with mindfulness training tends to make people more sensitive to environmental changes and to make them more willing to make changes in their own lives. Paul Wapner, who's a professor at American University, and is a specialist in the politics of environmental activism, is somebody who wrote an article on the benefits of Buddhist meditation on environmentalism and vice versa. So he says that meditation can help us look more deeply at our internal lives and thus enable us to identify our own interior causes of environmental harm. In other words, we understand how delusion, ill will, and greed are working in ourselves. It can also help us to avoid burnout. This would be by, adopting a broader time frame, such as seeing yourself in the context of the whole cosmos and its evolution, or on karma and rebirth. Um, and finally, it helps us to recognize interdependence of all kinds, biophysical and other kinds. Mindfulness continually reveals how our lives have been affected by others and our environment, even if that's not what we're intending to focus on. And on the other hand, environmental engagement can enhance contemplative lives. Since our awareness of environmental degradation brings up feelings of loss and sadness and anger and despair, meditation is something you can do that at least gives you a sense of having done something, and that improves our mood. But it also brings our feelings front and center so that we can examine them, and it deepens our understanding of impermanence, dependent arising, and emptiness. So he was just writing about general mindfulness practice. Uh, Other people have written, for instance, about how doing compassion practice also has the same kind of benefits. So now I'd like to move to talking about Joanna Macy's work. And there are dozens of contemplative exercises that she emphasizes in books such as Coming Back in Active Hope. And anyway, the title for this whole thing is The Work That Reconnects. And it's imagined as a kind of spiral, starting with gratitude and ending with going forth. But as you can see, it's been also pictured as a plant with gratitude at its root, honoring our pain for the world and seeing with new eyes as its body, and going forth as its distribution of seeds for further growth. So beginning from gratitude means that the practice is going to begin by recognizing our deep ties to the earth and its past and present occupants. Honoring our pain is going to enable us to express our fear, our grief, and our nostalgia, and so on. Seeing with new eyes, the main idea here is to shift your identity from being small and unrelated to other things to being linked with all people and all things. And this can also have contemplative practices that give us the sense of deep time, being, connected to previous generations. And then finally, going forth at this station you try to bring the fruits of these practices into your daily life and aspirations for the future. One thing that's emphasized is that this is active hope, a practice rather than an expectation, then things will work out in the end. So not requiring optimism. As they say, choosing life, affirming our indissoluble interbeing, and thinking, feeling, and acting in solidarity with all members of the Earth community are not means, but rather ends in themselves, right? You're doing something, even if all that you're doing is sitting on your cushion and going through these kinds of contemplative exercises. So the Buddhist approach in general, anyway, is to develop virtues and thereby become resources for others who are suffering. And in the Mahayana, especially, it's emphasized that this can take eons and eons of practice, before it finally bears fruit. So you have to have immense patience. I think of, and maybe you're familiar with this too, the Zen vows. So here's one version of them. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. So the real bodhisattva spirit is unconcerned with the odds. It takes on this Mahayana spirit of, it doesn't matter to me that it's a seemingly impossible task. I'm going to do it anyway. And then finally, what about reconciliation? Remember, Jim Bendall called for reconciling ourselves to bad future outcomes, including the collapse of civilization. Well, this approach agrees that in going forth, you might well have to realize that there's going to be a collapse. But, we're going to work with that, not run from it. Can't run from it anyway. Okay, so getting into these a little bit more, in coming from gratitude, here are a couple of practices that she has invented. One was called the Elm Dance. She began it in Germany in the 1980s. It uses a Latvian folk song. Anyway, as Joanna Macy reconfigured it, it's a circle dance. You hold hands, and then you sway for 4 beats. You move backwards for 4 beats. You move forwards for 4 beats. And you sway again, you retreat. So what you're trying to do is identify with trees, with the earth itself, and with the collective, the forest. So this one's been very popular, and people find it easy to imagine themselves being a tree in a forest. Another one, very different in its basis, is open sentences, also used for the other steps too. You pair up with another person, and you finish open sentences like, some things I like about being alive on Earth are, or a place that was magical to me as a child is, and so on like that. It really seems to help that someone else is asking us a question. Someone is waiting to hear us. We get a chance to tell our story, which of course most of us really love to do. So that's coming from gratitude. With respect to honoring pain, again, the pair sharing is a kind of prominent technique. A facilitator offers a series of open sentences, which each person repeats and completes. They also recommend, excuse me, the truth mandala. So participants form a circle. Mandala means circle. And then a guide places objects in each of the 4 quadrants, such as a stone representing the way our hearts contract when we're afraid, dry leaves representing sorrow, a stick representing anger, and an empty bowl representing our sense of deprivation and need. So here's a diagram that they've published. So one person at a time enters, takes an object, and speaks, expressing anger or powerlessness or fear or sorrow. And the whole idea of this is really tantric, I think. In tantric Buddhism, you use the imagination to transform poison into nourishment. So it's explained that the expression of sorrow is also an expression of love. And speaking about fear is actually also an expression of trust in your listeners and in your own courage. And anger is an expression of our passion for justice. And the empty bowl can be seen as the possibility for the new to arise. So it's an expression of how we're feeling, but also a way to transform these feelings into something positive for the future. So the third of these four parts is called Seeing with New Eyes. And the main idea here is to shift your identity from being small and unrelated to other things and to being linked to all people and all things. And one of these methods is called the Council of All Beings, which was invented by John Seed and Joanna Macy. So you take on the persona of a particular animal. Humans can be included too, because we're also animals. But the feeling is that you're chosen by a life form in order that you might speak on its behalf in the council. So these beings first express their power, like the unique and beautiful manifestation of life which they are. And then they detail the hardships that human greed and ignorance have imposed upon them. And then after speaking, the participant sets aside their mask and enter the center of the circle, and everybody directs their comments right to them. So here's a picture of a council of all beings that was held in the woods. You can see that certain objects have been placed in the center. Everyone's formed a circle. Some people are wearing masks to represent certain animals. The facilitators might ask them questions too, like, how can you help humans to stop harming you? Or what gifts, skills, and teachings can you pass on to humans? Sometimes the animals choose to put on human masks and move into the human world to observe it better and report on what they've seen. So I think that's really interesting. So this helps you also to gain a deep sense of deep time because you see yourself as part of the interdependent web of life, and you imagine that you have been all of these beings in your past reincarnations. You can also do something that's called harvesting the evolutionary gifts of our ancestors. And in this one, you contemplate each source of your body. So, like the worm apparently was the being in which there was first a heart, and fish, the being in which there was first a spine. And our brains, of course, are evolved from those of our mammalian ancestors, going back to little furry mouse-like creatures skittering around the feet of dinosaurs. Hands come from apes and so on. And then from our human ancestors, we can think about all the things that we get from the hunters and healers, the initial agrarians, the tool makers, and so on through all these centuries of human civilization. And then we can imagine passing these gifts on to our children, who will then pass them along to generation after generation. So the whole thing is about gaining a sense of your, interdependence with many others, past and present. There are also practices for the final station, which is called going forth, but I'm going to skip them to get to a practice that develops compassion for others, which is called tonglen. This is a Tibetan practice that means sending and receiving. It can be done in various ways, but the essence is to take on the suffering of others and to send them love and peace. So again, this is a tantric idea. You're transforming things in your imagination from bad into good. So you're going to inhale suffering and exhale love. So you can do this for yourself, imagining that all of your problems are a dark smoke that you inhale, and then because of the love in your heart, they are transformed, and you exhale white smoke that expresses joy. So again, problems in, love out. But Tonglen is usually expressed as a method to develop compassion for others. So according to the Kagyu teacher Tenzin Palmo, the idea is to develop compassion so great you would willingly exchange your good health for the suffering and disability of others. much as a mother might be willing to do for her child. So imagine that another person's suffering is a dark smoke that you breathe in into a dark pearl at your heart. By the way, the dark pearl in your heart represents your own self-cherishing. Breathing in this smoke breaks up the pearl, and then you exhale a white smoke that enters the other person and relieves their suffering. So that's Tonglen. So that in brief is, Joanna Macy's work that reconnects. Um, and before going on, I just wanted to do a brief reflection on talking about other people about collective action for climate change, and just noting that, Buddhism is essentially an educational system. You may not think of it that way. You may think of it as a religion, but what I mean is that it revolves around strategies for human liberation and perfection. And its founder is not a supernatural person, but a person who described himself as what? A teacher of the Dharma, which he did not invent, but discovered and passed along. Indeed, how do we usually translate Dharma? As the teaching. In fact, all the revered figures of Buddhism in all traditions are teachers. Arhats, bodhisattvas, lamas, gurus, senseis, teachers. So the question might be, how can a Buddhist or someone whose perspective is that of interdependence, but who doesn't call themselves a Buddhist, reach others? Well, first of all, I don't think it's necessary to refer to Buddhism, and probably not even very helpful. Thich Nhat Hanh, who I've pictured over there, was very skillful at talking about being aware and learning from nature, but without using Buddhist terminology, right? And a second principle, I think, is that people are at different stages in their preparation to receive messages. So I'm thinking about the Tibetan way of distinguishing three motivations for practicing Dharma, all of which are legitimate. And you have to practice where you have to start where you are, right? So first thing we need to do is to recognize, where are people? So beings of low capacity practice Dharma because they fear bad rebirths. So in climate change term, I think these are people who fear the personal consequences of climate change. So how do we address them? So they might be worried about, depending on where they live, the higher temperatures, the droughts, the floodings, the storms, and so forth, and the fact that they might lose their jobs or suffer with food scarcities or water scarcities and so on. Then you could also talk to them about their future concerns for their children and grandchildren. And we should realize that we can expect only a modest amount of sacrifice from these folks. They're probably going to grumble about any inconvenience, such as higher prices for energy or meat, but they may see that making changes to their own lifestyle is a good thing. And then what about beings of medium capacity? Traditionally, these are people who practice in order to attain liberation from suffering. Well, in terms of climate change, we might say these are people who are still somewhat self-centered, but they do want to save the world for future generations. So they may be receptive to contemplating various forms of the doctrine of dependent arising. They might be open to certain values, such as non-harming, um, and extending non-harming to non-human beings. They might be receptive to our critique of capitalism and consumerism. They might be receptive to arguments that it's better to be contented with a more modest lifestyle than to crave a lavish one, and so on. So I think if we understand the psychology of troubling emotions and gave them a sense of hope, they might be reached. And then finally, there are beings of highest capacity. In traditional terms, this means people who want to become Buddhas themselves to lift everyone else to an enlightened state. In terms of climate change, we might say these are people who care deeply about all life on the planet and who are willing to do whatever it takes to change the situation. And they would be receptive to just about everything in the Buddhist repertoire, but it would not be necessary and perhaps not even helpful to bring up the word Buddhism. They might be committed Christians, for instance, and they wouldn't really want to think that they were committing any kind of blasphemy. Um, but I think these people might benefit from the perspectives derived from Buddhism that although the human species might face decline, that the planet itself would adjust and adapt, and in the long run, life would continue. And they might benefit from the long view of Buddhism, which in this case, you might not have to state in terms of karma and rebirth, but just in terms of generations, the long view of evolution. Okay, well, that's enough about contemplation. I just want to end with a few examples of environmental activism in Asia. This is something that I really find fascinating. It's the idea of tree ordination. Um, so this is a very imaginative thing. Pakru Pitak Nantak Kun, a Buddhist abbot in northeast Thailand, since 1988 has conducted ceremonies to ordain trees. He says it's to remind people that nature ought to be considered equal to human beings. And we ought to treat the trees as if they are already holy. Anyway, that's what I've written there is a little story of how he came to make the decision to do this. But it has stopped logging companies, which is quite necessary because in Thailand, something like 75% of what had been a dense forest has been cleared. And this can be seen from space. Um, and it reminds me of pictures of the island of Hispaniola, which is in the Caribbean. Half of it is the Dominican Republic, and the other half is Haiti. And if you look at a satellite picture of Hispaniola, you can see the Dominican Republic side is pretty green, whereas the Haiti side is almost completely deforested, which means, of course, that its soil washes away and there are landslides, and you know the productivity of soil is way down and so forth. Um, here is a picture from space. On the right, you can see, a political map of where Thailand is. So this is the part that you can see comes up to the border with Laos and and beyond it. I guess it's just Laos. But you can see that right up to the border, it's almost completely denuded. And then on the other side of the border, it hasn't been. So Thailand is facing a real moment of decision here. And the monks are trying to help by trying to hold down deforestation. Here's another example. There's been an effort in Tibet by a respected Tibetan Lama in Eastern Tibet to move people to take up vegetarianism. And it's centered at the Larungar Buddhist Academy in Sichuan province. Anyway, this Nyingmo Lama, whose parents were nomads in Eastern Tibet, has gotten this started. The Larungar is a place where there's training of Buddhist monks in all sorts of different traditions. And it was enormous in 2016, but the Chinese decided that was too many, has done a lot of demolition, and now the population is down to 5,000, I guess. I couldn't find any more recent information. Let me just show you a couple of pictures. That's what Larungar looked like in 2015, just this vast hillside. Isn't that amazing? Uh, this was all done by lay people themselves. And then, the monks and nuns started to gather there, and, but a lot of this, I guess, has been demolished now. Anyway, getting back to vegetarianism, um, Tibet is a place that's where the valley floor is 12,000 feet above sea level. So it's very difficult to grow a lot of food there. And there were certainly a few lamas who followed a vegetarian diet and very few who wrote about it. This book, it translated as Food of Bodhisattvas, was written in the 18th century. Anyway, monastics and lay alike, if asked, would say it was impossible to be vegetarian because of the lack of grains and vegetables. Um, but Tibetans, who fled to India in the 1960s and 1970s, discovered that, of course, it was quite possible to have a good diet without including meat. And they've gradually engaged with this issue. So some lay people and some monasteries have voted to go vegetarian. But in Tibet, anyway, most people still eat meat daily. And nomads, who are the main interest of this campaign, eat a lot of meat. So the new virtues list that he has published in a book called Love and Compassion for Animals, he points out that animals undergo much suffering during their lives, that they have been our parents in the past, and we should have gratitude for that. That meat eating can lead to health problems such as high cholesterol and heart problems and so on. And then he published a new list of 10 Buddhist virtues, including not to sell livestock for slaughter, not to hunt, and not to wear animal fur as trim on coats. That's not so much about sheepskin like the guy on the right is wearing, as it is about endangered species such as tigers. This is the 17th Karmapa, who is a vegetarian himself and who has urged Tibetans to give up meat if they can. And as a result of the Larung Buddhist Academy and the 17th Karmapa, monastic meat eating in eastern Tibet has greatly declined. Many, if not most, have become vegetarian. There's no meat cooked in monastic kitchens, and individual monks and nuns have been encouraged to give it up. Among the laity, he's encouraged greatly the great reduction in meat consumption. So nomads who slaughter for their own consumption, to at least minimize the suffering of animals. Suffocation was used as a method for killing animals because it was bloodless, but it didn't bring about a quick death, but one that ended with struggling and fear. He encourages liberating livestock. He argues that Tibetans will seem more civilized than the Chinese if they will do this. And at least he asks everyone to pledge not to eat meat on 2 days a month, the new moon and full moon days, and at New Year, Losar and Sagadawa, which is the Buddha's birthday, which is usually in May. He himself has liberating lots of yaks, and other people have too. That's problematic, but we don't really need to get into that now. Then the final thing I wanted to bring before you was the topic of eco-villages, and one in particular that's in Sri Lanka. This is Karen Lifton, who I met in New Mexico in 2010, and who wrote a book about eco-villages around the world. Her book is a study of 14 eco-villages. And anyway, they're located in Africa, Australia, the US, Japan, the UK, Sri Lanka, Germany, and Denmark. They usually have a spiritual focus, although in some cases it's quite eclectic. I have an eco-village a few miles from me here in Ithaca, New York, which is secular too. Some are small with only about 50 members. Many are much larger. If you think about Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka as an eco-village, then you get one that's quite large. It's 15,000. So let me talk about Sarvodaya as a way of ending up. I think this is without a doubt the most significant Buddhist social movement. It wasn't formed in response to ecological problems. It was for more basic problems like clean water and housing for villages. But it promotes development in sustainable ways at the level of villages, which is where most Sri Lankans live. The term means awakening everybody. The term is taken from Gandhi, who was the inspiration for Dr. A.T. Aryaratne, who started this at Nalanda College in Sri Lanka. And he called it the Shramadana movement, which means labor giving, and then later gave it the name Sarvodaya. It spread first through colleges, and college students would go out and build community centers, dig wells, training centers, and so forth. But gradually it changed. So how does it work? Well, first of all, Sarvodaya goes to a village only by invitation. They check in with the local head monk and with the elders of the village. The idea is that everyone works together on a project. The motto is, we build the road and the road builds us. I think that's quite inspiring. The groups that form from this take on a life of their own and plan various projects. One of the things they do is to form a village awakening council, which is a democratic cross-section as opposed to the usual thing where village elders make all the decisions. And there have been many, many spin-offs from Sarvodaya, including a research institute, a disaster management center, preschools and early learning centers, orphanages, woodworking shops. You know, it's been a holistic movement with many, many elements. So there, like I said, it's touched over 15,000 villages across Sri Lanka. Today, there are over 3,000 active Sarvodaya Shramadana societies. So it has incorporated Buddhism deeply into its activity. I think this is interesting. So how does Sarvodaya talk about the Four Noble Truths? Well, the problem is dukkha, a decadent village. All suffering has a social context. The cause, self-cherishing, instead of cherishing ourselves along with others. The hope, which is the third noble truth, right? The cessation of the causes of suffering. Nirvana means the cessation of self-cherishing, the elimination of ignorance on a social level. And then the path is the path of Sarvodaya, Shramadana, working together in spiritual development and in physical development as well. So, of course, there's a Sarvodaya Eightfold Path. So among things they've done are build meditation centers for lay people. Lay people had never done meditation before, only the monks did. Emphasizing the sublime attitudes of love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Equanimity meaning give up the possession of results for yourself and let it be the community's, which I find interesting because the sublime attitudes are Mahayana, and Sri Lanka is a Theravada Buddhist country. The four principles of social behavior are generosity, pleasant speech, social equality, and constructive work, whether that's voluntary or paid. And then to go on about this, it also includes self-reliance, meaning, you know, that you have this decentralized organization so everybody can participate in it, that it develops social esteem, but for your culture and for the nation, and that it enhances solidarity. So they try to include all the religions of Sri Lanka, even though obviously this is a Buddhist-inspired movement. So they start with Christian prayer, inviting Christians to do the meditation, and they have done uh, a an ethnic exchange. You may be aware that that Hindus whose background is Tamil from Tamil Nadu, the southern part of India, have pitted themselves against Sinhalese Buddhists, Sinhalese being the major ethnic group of Sri Lanka. So this is an attempt to get over that feeling of enmity. And then there's the idea that we're all sharing labor, that we should all share food, that we should all share ideas. So it's 12:48 right now, and you know, maybe that would be a good place to stop. I'll just add that one of the reasons why this has become so effective in Sri Lanka is because the monks, who everybody has great regard for, have become leaders in this movement. You know, usually there's at least one monk who is included on the council that is planning these sorts of things. And many monks have been involved in this over the years. Of course, in the United States and other places, we don't have so many monks. And the monks don't have the same kind of status in our society. But insofar as, we do have religion as a strong force in our society, it points out that if you want to effectively reach people, you probably want to involve the clergy, right? So it'd be a good idea if in your community you brought on board a priest, a minister, a rabbi, and if you got one, a Buddhist monk or some other kind of Buddhist teacher. The more, the better. Okay, I'll stop there and see if you guys have some reactions or some questions to all this.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.